The weapon that saved more Marines in a single week on Okinawa than naval bombardment and napalm combined was nearly melted down for scrap metal. Nobody knew what it could do. Not the generals who ordered it to sit idle behind the lines. Not the logistics officers who called it a waste of steel. Not even the 6 men who crewed it every day who sat in its open turret playing cards while the war raged 3 miles to the south. This is the story of an anti-aircraft gun that was never meant to fire at the ground. A staff sergeant who disobeyed a direct order from men who outranked him by a mile. And a sound. A strange rhythmic mechanical sound that Japanese soldiers hiding inside a fortress of stone would come to call the death knock. But before we get there, you need to understand what made that sound necessary. You need to understand the hill. Okinawa, 1945. April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday. The largest amphibious invasion in the history of the Pacific War. Hell. They had been briefed on Japanese hell. They had been briefed on Japanese fortifications. They had studied the casualty reports from Peleliu, from Iwo Jima, from every blood-soaked island that came before. What they got instead was silence. The beaches were empty. The first wave hit the sand and met nothing. No machine gun fire, no mortar rounds, no screaming bonsai charges into the surf. Just wind and silence and the strange unsettling feeling of a trap not yet sprung. The troops joked that it was an April Fool's prank. They pushed inland almost unopposed. They secured the northern half of the island in a matter of weeks. Some men began writing letters home, saying this one might be easy. Some men began believing the war was almost over. They did not know that Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, had let them walk ashore on purpose. Ushijima was not like the commanders who had thrown their men into suicidal beach assaults on other islands. He was patient. He was calculating. And he had spent an entire year turning the southern third of Okinawa into something the Americans had never faced before. A defensive line that stretched from coast to coast, anchored on ancient Shuri Castle at its center with nearly 100,000 soldiers dug into a network of tunnels and caves carved deep into the coral limestone. He called it the Shuri Line. The strategy was unlike anything in the Pacific War. No charges, no glory, just wait. Let the Americans come south. Let them climb the ridges and the hills. And when they reach the top, kill them from every direction at once. At the western end of this great defensive wall where the line met the sea, 3 small hills formed the anchor. The Japanese called them by military designations. The Americans gave them names that sounded almost gentle. Half Moon, Horseshoe, and Sugarloaf. Sugarloaf Hill stood 50 feet tall and maybe 300 yards long. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a bump in the road, a pile of dirt and coral barely worth noticing. The Marines who first laid eyes on it on the morning of May 12th thought they could take it before lunch. They could not have been more wrong. Over the next 6 days, that insignificant little hill would consume more than 2,600 Marines, killed, wounded, or shattered beyond the ability to fight. Another 1,200 would be evacuated for what the medical officers called combat fatigue, a term that sounds clean on paper, but looked like men staring at nothing, unable to speak. Unable to move, unable to remember their own names. The hill would be assaulted 11 separate times. Companies would be wiped out, replaced, wiped out again. The same 50 feet of dirt would change hands over and over, each exchange paid for in blood that ran down the slopes and pooled in the ravines below until the mud itself turned red. But the worst part was not the dying. The worst part was how the dying happened. And to understand that, you need to understand the caves. The boy from South Boston, Private First Class James Sullivan, was 19 years old, and he was lying face down in a shell crater at the base of Sugarloaf Hill, and he was using the bodies of dead Marines as a shield. He had been there for 3 days. Sullivan came from South Boston, Massachusetts. His father worked the shipyards. His grandfather had fought in France in 1918 and came home with a limp and stories he never finished. Sullivan enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1944, trained at Camp Pendleton in California, and shipped out to the Pacific with the 22nd Regiment of the 6th Marine Division, the newest division in the Corps. He was 19 years old and he was listening to his friends die one by one, and he could not see who was killing them. The rain had turned everything to mud. Not clean mud. Mud mixed with blood and fragments of things Sullivan did not want to identify. The smell was something he would carry for the rest of his life. Cordite and copper and the sweet rotting stench of bodies that had been lying in tropical heat for days. Above him, cut into the cliff face of Sugarloaf, Dozens of cave mouths stared down like the eyes of something ancient and patient. Every time someone moved, a rifle cracked from somewhere overhead. The sound echoed off the rock faces in every direction, making it impossible to tell where the shot came from. Every time a squad tried to advance, a machine gun opened up from a cave opening that had been invisible a moment before. Marines would fall, the survivors would crawl back, and the caves would go silent again, waiting. Sullivan remembered the first day. May 12th. Company G of the 2nd Battalion. Captain Owen Stebbins leading them forward with tank support toward what they all thought was just a low rise of ground. 900 yards of open terrain, almost no resistance. Then the hill woke up. Machine gun fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Mortar rounds walking across the open ground from Horseshoe Hill to the south. Sniper fire from Half Moon to the east. And from Sugarloaf itself, a dozen cave mouths that no one had seen suddenly erupting with fire. Every angle covered every approach, a killing field. Company G lost half its strength in 2 hours. Every weapon failed. The Marines tried everything. Nothing worked. And the reason nothing worked was geometry. They tried grenades. The cave openings were cut into the cliff face 30 to 40 feet above the base of the hill. A man cannot throw a grenade 40 feet straight up with any accuracy. The grenades bounced off the rock and rolled back down the slope. Sometimes they killed the men who threw them. Some Marines tried climbing closer. The snipers in the caves picked them off before they got within range. They tried flamethrowers. The M2 portable flamethrower had an effective range of maybe 60 to 120 feet. But range means nothing when you are trying to shoot upward against gravity. The burning fuel splashed against the cliff face below the cave mouths and slid back down a curtain of fire that accomplished nothing except marking the position of the man carrying 60 pounds of compressed fuel on his back. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Okinawa was 4 minutes in active combat. The Japanese snipers considered them priority targets. They tried the Zippo tanks. The flame-throwing Shermans had been the most effective cave-busting weapon in the entire Pacific War. At Iwo Jima Battalion, commanders called them the single most valuable weapon in the operation. But at Sugar Loaf, the terrain was too steep, the mud too deep for a 30-ton tank to maneuver effectively. And even the Zippo's 120-foot flame stream could not defy gravity. You cannot shoot fire straight up. They tried standard Sherman tanks. The 75mm main gun on the M4A3 had a maximum elevation of roughly 25 degrees. Enough to engage targets at the same level or slightly above. Completely useless when the target was nearly vertical overhead. Tank crews at Sugar Loaf reported seeing the cave mouths clearly, but being physically unable to raise their gun barrels high enough to engage them. The engineering that made the Sherman the backbone of American armor in every theater of the war had not anticipated a fight where the enemy lived on the ceiling. They tried naval bombardment. The fleet offshore pounded Sugar Loaf before every assault, thousands of shells tearing up the surface. Bombers made run after run. The ground shook. Dust and debris filled the air. And when the smoke cleared, the Japanese crawled back out of their tunnels and resumed firing. The cave system had been engineered specifically to survive this kind of attack. The tunnels zigzagged deep into the rock, absorbing blast waves that would have destroyed any surface position. The bombardment looked devastating from the air. It accomplished almost nothing underground. Every weapon in the American arsenal was designed to fire horizontally, from the ground forward or from the sky downward. Not a single weapon on the island was designed to fire accurately upward at steep angles into small openings cut into vertical rock faces. This was the gap. This was the flaw in the most powerful military machine the world had ever assembled. And the Japanese had found it. And they were exploiting it with devastating precision. The charge that broke hearts. The night of May 14, 1945. Major Henry A. Courtney, Jr. stood in the darkness at the base of Sugarloaf Hill and counted what was left of his command. The 2nd Battalion of the 22nd Marines had been at this for 3 days. More than half the battalion was gone. The men who remained were filthy hollow-eyed and operating on something beyond exhaustion. Some of them had stopped flinching at gunfire, not out of bravery, out of a numbness that the medical officers recognized as the first stage of complete psychological collapse. Courtney gathered volunteers. Only 44 men stood up. He looked at them. 44 out of what had been a full-strength battalion. He did not sugarcoat what was coming. When we go up there, some of us are never going to come down again. You all know what hell it is on the top. But that hill has got to be taken, and we are going to do it. I am going up to the top of Sugarloaf Hill. Who is coming along? 44 men followed him into the darkness. They moved up the forward slope in silence, step by step through ground that was more graveyard than battlefield. They reached the crest. They took the summit. For a few hours in the dark, the hill belonged to the United States Marines. When dawn broke, the Japanese counterattacked from every direction. Courtney was killed by mortar fragments on the hilltop he had taken. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Most of the 44 who followed him were killed or wounded in the same assault. The hill was lost again, for the 5th time in 6 days. Down at the base, Sullivan heard the firing intensify, then fade, then intensify again. He did not know Courtney was dead. He did not know the name of the man who had just led 44 volunteers into the most hopeless charge of the Pacific War. He only knew that every morning more bodies rolled down the slopes of Sugarloaf Hill, and every evening another plan to take the hill had failed. But what Sullivan could not have known, what nobody at Sugarloaf knew, was that 3 miles to the north, sitting in a sand revetment near Higuchi Beach, there was a weapon that could solve every one of these problems. A weapon that could elevate its barrels to 85 degrees above horizontal, almost straight up. A weapon with enough explosive force to collapse cave mouths and enough rate of fire to walk destruction along an entire cliff face in minutes. And it was about to be melted down for scrap. The coffin on tracks. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you served in the military, or if your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, you have probably heard stories about the caves. The Japanese tunnel systems that nothing could crack. Drop a comment below if you have a family connection to Okinawa or to the Pacific Campaign. And stay with me, because what this staff sergeant did next was something the generals never saw coming, and it changed the course of a battle that was eating the Marine Corps alive. Staff Sergeant Thomas Brennan was 28 years old, and he had not fired his weapon in anger since arriving on Okinawa 6 weeks earlier. Brennan was not a Marine. He was United States Army assigned to an anti-aircraft automatic weapons battalion attached to the 10th Army for the Okinawa campaign. He came from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father had spent 30 years pouring steel at the Carnegie plant, and Brennan had grown up with the sound of metal and machinery in his bones. He enlisted in 1942, trained on anti-aircraft systems, and eventually found himself commanding an M19 gun motor carriage on an island in the Pacific, pointing his guns at a sky that held nothing worth shooting at. The M19 was built on the lengthened chassis of an M24 Chaffee light tank. Twin Cadillac 5.8 engines mounted in the center of the hull, producing a combined 220 horsepower. At the rear, an open-top turret mounted 2 Bofors 40mm automatic cannons fed by 4-round clips that the loaders hand-fed into the gravity mechanisms. The turret rotated a full 360 degrees. The guns could depress to 5 degrees below horizontal and elevate to 85 degrees above it. Practically vertical. The armor was thin, half an inch at best along the front hull, a 1/4 inch on the turret shield. Enough to stop a pistol round or shrapnel fragments at distance, not enough to stop a rifle bullet at close range. And the turret had no roof. The crew of 6 sat in the open air, exposed to the sky, exposed to everything. The vehicle carried 352 rounds of 40mm ammunition on board, with another 320 on an M28 trailer towed behind. Every time the M19 rolled past an infantry position, soldiers laughed. They called it the coffin on tracks. They called it the paper tank. They pointed at the open turret and made bets on how many minutes the crew would survive in a real fight. A logistics officer on an inspection visit looked at it and said without irony that they should melt it down for scrap. At least then, it would contribute something to the war effort. Brennan said nothing to any of them. He had learned that arguing with logistics officers was like arguing with weather. You might feel better afterward, but nothing changed. But in the silence, Thomas Brennan was thinking. He had been reading the combat reports coming back from the front lines. Unofficial copies passed to him by runner teams and medics who moved between the rear and the forward positions. He read about the caves. He read about the elevation problem. He read about Marines dying because no weapon could shoot high enough. And one night, sitting on the turret of his M19 under a pale Pacific moon, Brennan looked up at the twin Bofors barrels silhouetted against the stars and saw something that no general, no tactics officer, and no weapons specialist on the entire island had considered. Every weapon on this island fires horizontal. Not one of them fires up. But these guns can fire up. 85 degrees, almost straight up at the sky. The same geometry that made the M19 useless against tanks made it perfect for engaging cave mouths cut into vertical cliff faces. The extreme elevation designed to track diving aircraft was exactly the angle needed to pump explosive shells into openings 30 or 40 feet above ground level. Each 40mm Bofors round weighed just under 2 pounds and packed enough high explosive to destroy an aircraft engine. When that shell struck the limestone around a cave opening, it would not just create blast damage, it would turn the rock itself into shrapnel, fragments of coral and stone blasting inward with the force of the explosion. And inside the confined space of the cave, the pressure would multiply. The walls would become weapons. The fortress would become a tomb. Brennan pulled out a pencil and a scrap of paper. He calculated the angles. At 15 meters from the base of the cliff with the cave mouth 12 meters up the required elevation was roughly 75 degrees. His guns could reach 85. He had margin to spare. And even at 50 meters out, the 40-degree angle was still far beyond what any tank gun on the island could achieve. He calculated the ammunition. 6 to 10 rounds per cave to collapse it. With 672 rounds between the vehicle and the trailer, he could engage 60 to 100 positions. Brennan did not sleep that night. He sat on the turret with his pencil and his scrap of paper running the numbers again and again, checking his geometry against the reports, measuring angles in his mind against cave mouths he had never seen. The moon tracked slowly across the sky above him. The distant rumble of artillery rolled in from the south like thunder that never stopped. For the first time since setting foot on Okinawa, his weapon had a reason to exist. He looked at his crew sleeping around the vehicle. Corporal Frank Rossetti, the gunner from Brooklyn, a former automobile mechanic who never wasted a word or emotion. Private First Class Anthony Moretti, the other gunner 20 years old, the son of a Philadelphia bakery owner who cracked jokes about everything until the moment things got serious. Corporal Roy Patterson in the assistant driver's seat, a farmer from Iowa, the oldest man in the crew after Brennan himself. Private First Class Daniel Walsh, 19, a loader from Chicago who had finished training only 4 months earlier. And Private First Class Robert Kowalski, 21. The other loader from Milwaukee, whose mother had sent him off to war with 3 pounds of homemade sausage and a letter he still kept folded inside his helmet liner. 6 men. One vehicle that everyone on this island had already written off as worthless, and an idea that Brennan could not shake loose from his mind no matter how many times the system told him no. And somewhere to the south, in the mud and the blood and the rain, James Sullivan lay in his shell crater at the base of Sugarloaf Hill and listened to the sound of another night assault failing on the slopes above him. Another wave of men climbing into the dark. Another cascade of rifle fire and screams. He did not know that 3 miles behind him, a 28-year-old staff sergeant from Pittsburgh was staring at his twin Bofors guns and doing arithmetic that could change everything. What Sullivan did not know would fill a book. But the most important thing he did not know was this. Help was coming. It was just riding in a vehicle that everyone had already written off as dead. 3 times no. Brennan submitted his first request the morning after his calculations. A formal written request through his battalion's chain of command, asking permission to move the M19 gun motor carriage to a forward position near Sugarloaf Hill in order to provide direct fire support against Japanese cave emplacements. The request was denied within 1 hour. The reason given was 4 words long. M19 is anti-aircraft, stays anti-aircraft. Brennan read the denial slip and set it on the turret ledge next to his pencil drawings of firing angles and cave mouth positions. He stared at it for a while. Then he wrote a second request. This one was 2 pages long. He described the specific tactical problem at Sugarloaf Hill in detail. He explained how the twin Bofors 40mm guns could engage elevated cave positions at angles no other weapon on the island could achieve. He attached diagrams showing the geometry. He cited the elevation capability of 85 degrees. He calculated the number of rounds needed per cave. He even estimated the rate of advance that infantry could achieve once the interlocking fields of fire were disrupted. The second request vanished into the command system and never came back. No denial, no acknowledgement. Just silence, as if the paper itself had dissolved somewhere between his battalion headquarters and the division staff. The third time Brennan went in person, he stood in front of a captain from the operations section and laid out his case with the patient clarity of a man who has rehearsed every word. The captain listened. Then he leaned back in his chair and spoke. "Sergeant, I understand you want to help, but if you drive that vehicle to the front line and it gets destroyed, who is responsible? The generals have made their decision. The M19 stays in the rear. 3 requests, 3 refusals, and every day the casualty reports from Sugarloaf Hill grew longer. Every day Brennan sat on his M19 and pointed his guns at a sky that held nothing worth shooting at, while 3 miles south men were dying because nobody could shoot high enough to reach the caves that were killing them. The Japanese Air Force had been swept from the Pacific months ago. The kamikazes still threatened the fleet offshore, but they did not attack ground targets. The entire reason the M19 existed on Okinawa had evaporated. 6 men and a perfectly functional weapons platform sat idle in a sand revetment, waiting for an enemy that would never come, while the real enemy sat in caves that no one on the island could touch. Brennan looked at his crew. Rossetti cleaning the breach mechanisms with the quiet precision of a man who maintained machines the way other men breathed. Moretti writing a letter home that he kept restarting because he could not find words that did not sound like a goodbye. Patterson reading a week-old newspaper from Honolulu, the same page over and over, not really seeing the words. Walsh and Kowalski playing cards on an ammunition crate betting cigarettes, neither of them smoked. Good men. Ready men. And the system would not let them fight. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. Here is a staff sergeant who has figured out the solution to a problem that is killing hundreds of United States Marines. He has done the math. He has drawn the diagrams. He has written the proposal. And the system has said no, 3 times. Not because the idea is wrong, not because the math does not work, but because the idea does not fit the category. Because somewhere in a manual, someone wrote that the M19 is an anti-aircraft weapon, and that is the end of the discussion. If you have ever had an idea that the people in charge refuse to hear, you know exactly how Thomas Brennan felt sitting on that turret. If you have ever watched a problem get worse while the solution sat right in front of everyone and nobody would act, you know the frustration that was eating him alive. Drop a like if you have been in that situation. And stay with me, because what Brennan did next could have ended his military career or saved hundreds of lives, or both. The decision, night of May 16th. Another failed assault on Sugar Loaf. Another wave of Marines cut down on the slopes. Total American casualties at the hill now exceeded 2,000. 3 battalions effectively destroyed, and the hill still belonged to the Japanese. Brennan gathered his crew around the M19 in the darkness. 6 men standing in the warm Pacific night listening to the distant thunder of artillery to the south. He did not ask for a vote. He told them what he was going to do. I am driving this vehicle to the front line tonight. No orders. No permission. If we are caught before we get there, I will take full responsibility. If it does not work, I will face a court-martial. But men are dying out there because nobody will fire upward, and we are the only crew on this island that can fire upward. So I am going, and I need to know if you are coming with me. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Rossetti, the gunner from Brooklyn. 24 years old. A man who had repaired automobile engines in a Flatbush garage before the war, and who never used 2 words when one would do, looked at Brennan. He nodded once. Moretti, the other gunner. 20 years old, the son of a bakery owner in South Philadelphia, who could make you laugh on the worst day of your life, was not laughing now. His jaw was set. He nodded. Patterson, the assistant driver from Iowa. 26, a corn farmer who had traded his tractor for a tank chassis, and who was the oldest man in the crew, after Brennan himself, spoke 3 words. I am tired of sitting here. Walsh, the loader from Chicago. 19 years old, 4 months out of training, a kid who still had acne on his chin swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. He nodded. Kowalski, the other loader. 21 from Milwaukee, whose Polish mother had packed him 3 pounds of homemade kielbasa. The day he shipped out, and whose letter home still sat unfinished in his helmet liner, looked at the ground for a long moment. Then he looked up. My mother will kill me if I die because I disobeyed orders. He paused. But she will kill me more if I sit here while people are dying. Brennan started the engines. Twin Cadillac 5.8s roared to life in the darkness louder than he wanted, but there was no quiet way to start a 14-ton vehicle. The M19 crawled out of its revetment, towing the M28 ammunition trailer behind it, and turned south, toward the sound of the guns. The night road, the road from Hagushi Beach to the forward positions near Sugar Loaf, was 5 kilometers of darkness. Brennan drove without headlights, navigating by the glow of distant fires and the periodic white flash of illumination rounds drifting down on parachutes over the front lines. The road was cratered from shelling. Wrecked vehicles sat in the ditches like the skeletons of dead animals. Once, Brennan had to steer around a shape in the road that he recognized as a body and chose not to look at closely. Patterson sat in the assistant driver's seat, keeping the radio volume low. They did not want anyone in the command structure to know they were moving until it was too late to stop them. Halfway there, they passed an ambulance convoy heading the opposite direction, a long line of trucks loaded with stretchers moving north away from the fighting. A medic standing in the back of one truck spotted the distinctive twin barrels of the M19 and shouted through the darkness, "You are going the wrong way. Japanese planes are at sea, not on land." Brennan did not answer. He kept driving, crouched among the ammunition boxes. Pre-crouched among the ammunition boxes. Pre-loading 4-round clips into every available space, building a wall of ready ammunition around themselves so that when the firing started, they would not have to reach far. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the grind of the tracks on broken road, the low throb of the twin engines, and the distant percussion of war growing louder with every meter they traveled south. Each man understood what the open turret meant. It meant there was nothing between them and the sky. Nothing to stop a grenade dropped from above. Nothing to deflect a rifle round fired straight down. They were driving into a fight where their armor was meaningless, and their only protection was the speed of their guns. 60 seconds. 4 in the morning. The M19 reached Captain Hargrove's company position in the darkness below Sugarloaf Hill. Nobody laughed when it appeared. They were too exhausted to laugh. They were too busy counting the empty spaces where friends had been. Brennan climbed down and found Hargrove in a shallow trench. The captain looked at him with eyes that had seen too many men die in too few days. The kind of eyes that stopped processing emotions somewhere around the 300th casualty. "Sir, I command an M19 anti-aircraft vehicle. I want to use the 40mm guns against the K positions on the cliff face." Hargrove looked at Brennan for a long time. Then he looked at the M19 sitting in the darkness behind him, its twin barrels pointed at nothing. "You want to drive that thing to the base of the cliff?" "Yes, sir." "That is point-blank range. They will drop grenades straight down on you. They will fire rifles into your open turret from directly above. You will be dead in 60 seconds. "Maybe, sir, but those 60 seconds might be long enough." Hargrove turned and looked at the cliff face of Sugarloaf, invisible in the darkness, but absolutely present the way a thing that has been killing your men for a week is always present even when you cannot see it. He looked at the body still lying on the forward slope that no one had been able to retrieve. He looked back at the M19. "Do it." 30 yards away in a foxhole filled with 3 inches of bloody rainwater. Private First Class James Sullivan heard the exchange. He raised his head just enough to see the strange vehicle with its twin barrels pointing at the sky. He thought the same thing every infantryman at Sugarloaf had thought when they saw something new arrive at the front. Just another way to die. POMP, dawn. May 17th, 1945. The first light of morning touched the cliff face of Sugarloaf Hill, and Thomas Brennan pushed the throttle forward. 200 meters of open ground between the infantry line and the base of the cliff. Brennan drove straight across it, threading between shell craters and fragments of things that had once been human beings, with the cold focus of a man who had accepted that the next 10 minutes would determine whether he lived or died, and whether anything he believed about his weapon was true. The Japanese spotted the M19 immediately. Rifle fire erupted from multiple cave mouths along the cliff face. Rounds pinged and sparked off the thin armor, a sound like hailstones on a tin roof, rapid and sharp and everywhere at once. A grenade sailed down from above and detonated 3 meters to the left of the vehicle. Rock fragments sprayed upward and rained into the open turret. Walsh felt something slice across his cheek. He wiped blood with the back of his hand and kept feeding clips. Brennan did not stop. He did not slow down. He drove straight to the base of the cliff until the rock face filled the sky above them. At 50 meters, Moretti elevated the twin barrels to 60 degrees and opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the infantry had ever heard on Okinawa. Not the deep singular thump of a Sherman 75mm cannon. Not the sustained roar of the Browning Quad 50 that tore the air like ripping canvas. This was something else entirely. A rhythmic double beat, precise and mechanical, 2 barrels firing in precise alternation, each shot a fraction of a second after the other. A sound that was not chaotic like battle, but ordered like a machine, like a pulse, like a heartbeat. Pomp, 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 pomp. It echoed off the cliff face and rolled across the battlefield, and every man who heard it stopped what he was doing and turned toward the sound because it was new. And in combat, new sounds either save you or kill you, and you need to know which one immediately. When the first round struck the coral limestone surrounding a cave mouth, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The rock did not just crack, it shattered. Fragments of stone and calcium blasted inward with the force of the detonation, turning the cave walls themselves into a storm of shrapnel. And inside the confined space, the pressure wave had nowhere to go. It bounced off the rock walls and amplified again and again in a fraction of a second. The men inside were hit not just by the shell, but by their own fortress. The first cave collapsed after 6 rounds. The limestone, weakened by millennia of tropical erosion, could not withstand the concentrated hammering of high-explosive shells detonating directly against its structure. The mouth that had poured fire down onto Marines for 3 straight days simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a dark slot in the rock face with a machine gun barrel protruding from it. The next moment, it was a pile of rubble and a cloud of white dust drifting across the cliff face. Rossetti traversed this turret 10 degrees to the right and engaged the next cave opening. Pomp, 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 pomp. The shells walked up the cliff face in a neat ascending line, found the dark opening, punched inside, and detonated in the confined space. A secondary explosion followed. Ammunition stored inside the cave cooking off from the heat and pressure. Black smoke boiled out of the shattered mouth for a few seconds before the entire structure folded inward on itself. Brennan called it the snip maneuver. Find the cave mouth. Put the rounds precisely inside it. Let the confined space do the rest. The explosion has nowhere to escape. The pressure has nowhere to release. The defenders are crushed by the very stone that was supposed to protect them. Cave number 3. Cave number 5. Cave number 8. Each one the same sequence. Identify. Traverse. Elevate. Fire. 6 to 10 rounds. Observe. If silence, move on. If still firing, shoot again. Each one accompanied by the same sound rolling across the hillside like a drumbeat. The kill zone. At 30 meters from the cliff base, Moretti elevated the barrels to nearly 80 degrees. They were firing almost straight up now. Empty brass casings rained down around the turret like metal hail. The barrels were glowing from the heat of continuous fire. Ammunition was depleting at an alarming rate. And the crew was now inside what Brennan would later call the kill zone. Close enough for Japanese defenders to fire rifles directly down into the open turret. Close enough for a well-placed grenade to end everything. The first minute. A Japanese grenade dropped from a cave mouth directly above and fell into the fighting compartment of the turret. It landed on the turret floor between Rossetti's feet. Rossetti did not think. There was no time to think. His hand shot down, closed around the grenade, and threw it out over the side of the turret in a single motion that took less than 2 seconds. The grenade detonated 2 meters from the vehicle. The blast wave rocked the M19 on its suspension and peppered the hull with fragments. Rossetti looked down at his hand. It was still attached. He turned back to the gun controls. The second minute. A rifle round fired from almost directly overhead punched through the top of Moretti's left shoulder. Blood sprayed across the breech mechanism. Moretti did not stop firing. He locked his right hand around the firing grip and continued to traverse and elevate with one arm, while his left arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking through his sleeve and dripping onto the turret floor. Walsh, the 19-year-old loader from Chicago, began feeding ammunition clips faster, compensating for Moretti's reduced capacity, his hands moving in a blur of brass and steel. The third minute. A mortar round impacted behind the M19 close enough to spray shrapnel across the rear deck and the ammunition trailer. Brennan felt something strike his helmet. A fragment. Small. It did not penetrate the steel. He kept driving. Patterson in the assistant driver's seat called out over the noise. Right track is slightly loose but still functional. Kowalski, the other loader, was inserting clips at a rate he had never achieved in training, his fingers raw and blistering from contact with brass casings, superheated by the rate of fire, and he did not stop, did not slow, did not look at his hands. 3 minutes inside the kill zone. 3 minutes that should have destroyed the vehicle and everyone in it. And the M19 kept firing. Cave sweeper. The vehicle moved along the base of the cliff like a predator working a fence line. Methodical, patient, relentless. The turret rotated in slow, steady increments, pausing at each cave mouth just long enough to deliver 6 to 10 rounds before traversing to the next. The sound never stopped. Pomp, 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 pomp. A mechanical heartbeat that echoed off the stone and rolled across the battlefield in waves. From his foxhole, Sullivan watched in disbelief. The strange vehicle with the twin barrels was crawling along the cliff face, its guns pointed nearly straight up, firing continuously. And for the first time in 5 days, the gunfire from above was decreasing. The cave mouths were going silent one by one, like candles being blown out along a shelf. One moment spitting fire, the next moment dark and still and choked with rubble. Sullivan raised his head. No bullet came. He crawled out of his foxhole, still alive. He stood up fully upright for the first time in 3 days. Still alive. He looked left and right and saw other Marines doing the same thing, rising from their holes like men emerging from graves, blinking in the daylight, looking at each other with the stunned expression of people who had already made peace with dying and now had to reconsider. The infantry began to advance. They followed the M19 the way infantry follows armor, using the hull as cover, moving in its shadow. For the first time since the battle began, Marines at Sugarloaf Hill were moving forward instead of backward. Sullivan looked at the vehicle he had called a coffin on tracks the week before. He would never call it that again. He called it what every infantryman at Sugarloaf would soon call it, the name that would follow the M19 for the rest of the campaign and beyond. Cave Sweeper. Inside a cave on the cliff face, approximately 200 meters east of the M19's current position, Corporal Tanaka of the 62nd Division pressed himself against the wet stone wall and listened. Tanaka had been inside this cave for 6 days. He and 8 comrades shared a space no larger than a small bedroom. It was dark except when someone fired out through the narrow opening. The air was thick with gun smoke, sweat, and the smell of human waste from the corner they used as a latrine. They ate rice balls and drank from canteens that were running low. They slept in shifts on bare rock. But they were confident. They had been taught that their cave positions were impregnable, and for 6 days that teaching had proven correct. They had watched American tanks fire uselessly at the cliff, their gun barrels unable to elevate high enough. They had watched grenades bounce back down the slope. They had watched flamethrowers lick the rock below them without reaching the cave mouth. They had felt the shaking of naval shells and aerial bombs, and emerged afterward to resume firing. Nothing could reach them. That was what they believed. Then Tanaka heard a new sound. Pomp, pomp. It was unlike anything in his experience. Not the heavy concussion of a large caliber shell. Not the continuous tearing sound of a machine gun. This was rhythmic, mechanical. 2 beats in rapid succession repeating in a steady cadence. Like a heartbeat. Like something knocking at a door. The cave next to his, 5 meters to the west, exploded. Rock fragments blew through the gaps and cracks between the 2 positions. The shockwave hit Tanaka in the chest hard enough to push him backward against the wall. Dust blinded him. Screaming came from the adjacent cave, high and ragged. Then silence. Pomp, pomp, pomp. The sound was closer now. It was moving along the cliff face, moving toward his cave, one position at a time. Tanaka looked at his comrades. For the first time he saw fear on their faces. Not the fear of death. They had prepared for death. Every one of them had written their final letters. Every one of them had accepted that they would not leave this island alive. This was a different fear. The fear of realizing that the fortress you trusted with your life is not a fortress at all. And then something happened that had almost never occurred in the entire Pacific War. Some of them broke. Japanese soldiers began emerging from cave positions with their hands raised, climbing down from the rock face, stumbling across the rubble, walking toward the American lines with empty hands and dust-covered faces, and eyes that had seen something inside those caves that was worse than captivity. Worse than the shame their officers had promised. They chose surrender over being buried alive under their own stone. Marines who had been dying for 5 days stood and watched in silence as soldiers they believed would fight to the last breath came staggering out of the hillside, weeping. One of them was young, 17, maybe 18. His uniform was torn. His face was white with limestone dust except where blood had traced lines from his hairline to his jaw. His eyes were wide and wild and fixed on something only he could see. He walked toward Sullivan and stopped. 2 young men, opposite sides of the world, both 19 or close to it, both so exhausted that standing required conscious effort, both afraid, both wanting to live. Sullivan lowered his rifle. He raised his left hand and gestured toward the rear. Go! The Japanese soldier walked past him, and Sullivan realized that this was the first time he had seen the enemy as a human being and not as a target in his sights. I have to pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you saw or heard something that completely changed what you thought was possible? Something that took everything you believed to be true and shattered it in a single moment? Because that is exactly what happened on Sugarloaf Hill that morning. Marines who had lost friends, who had watched their companies destroyed, who had come to believe that this hill could not be taken. watched Japanese soldiers they thought would fight to the last man come stumbling out of caves with tears on their faces. And the sound that broke them was a sound nobody had ever heard before. The rhythmic double beat of twin Bofors 40mm guns firing almost straight up into the sky. If this story is hitting you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every single like tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard. By noon, the M19 had fired nearly all of its 672 rounds. The barrels were dangerously overheated. The turret traverse mechanism was grinding from hours of continuous use. Moretti had been evacuated to the rear, with his shoulder wound replaced by an infantry volunteer who had never operated a Bofors gun in his life, but was willing to learn on the spot because what he had just witnessed was worth any risk. And Sugarloaf Hill was crumbling. The cave system that had held the American advance for nearly a week was being destroyed position by position. The interlocking fields of fire that had created overlapping kill zones across every approach were now full of gaps. Dead gaps. Silent gaps. Gaps where cave mouths had been and rubble now sat. And through those gaps, infantry was finally advancing up slopes that had been impassable 12 hours earlier. The battle was not over. Days of hard fighting remained, but the turning point had arrived, and every man on that hillside knew exactly what had caused it. The M19 limped back toward the rear on a track that was losing links, its engines overheating, its crew covered in dust and blood and spent brass. The armor was pockmarked with bullet strikes and shrapnel scars. The turret was littered with empty casings that nobody had found time to clear. At the sand revetment, the logistics officer who had suggested melting the M19 for scrap was waiting. He looked at the vehicle. He looked at Brennan climbing out of the driver's hatch. He listened to the sound of Marine rifle fire advancing up Sugarloaf, moving across terrain that had been a graveyard since May 12th. He said nothing. He turned and walked away. Behind them, fading with distance but still audible, the last echoes of the pomp-pomp rolled across the ridgeline. And on the slopes of Sugarloaf Hill for the first time in nearly a week, the sound was not the sound of men dying. It was the sound of men moving forward. The report. The report went up the chain of command the next morning. It was written by Captain Hargrove in careful, measured language, the kind of language that officers use when they know that what they are describing will make someone above them look bad. The report described the cave-busting capability of the twin 40mm Bofors guns mounted on the M19 gun motor carriage. It described the extreme elevation angle that allowed the weapon to engage enemy positions that no other ground-based system on the island could reach. It described the systematic collapse of fortified cave emplacements along the cliff face of Sugarloaf Hill. It described the psychological effect of sustained rapid fire on enemy morale, noting specifically that Japanese soldiers had surrendered in numbers virtually unprecedented in the Pacific campaign. It recommended that all available M19 gun motor carriages be immediately redeployed from their anti-aircraft role to direct ground support. The report climbed from company to battalion to regiment to division. At each level, an officer read it, initialed it, and passed it upward. By the time it reached the staff offices of the 10th Army, the numbers attached to it were impossible to ignore. Casualties at Sugarloaf Hill before the M19 intervention. Hundreds per day. No measurable advance. 3 battalions functionally destroyed. 11 assaults. 11 failures. An entire Marine division being ground to pieces against a hill that should have taken 1 afternoon to capture. Casualties at Sugarloaf Hill after the M19 intervention. A sharp and sudden decline. Measurable advance within hours. Japanese defenders surrendering. Cave positions collapsing. Infantry moving forward across terrain that had been a killing field since May 12th. The generals read this report. The same generals who had denied Brennan's request 3 times. The same generals who had insisted that the M19 was an anti-aircraft weapon and would remain in an anti-aircraft role. The same generals who had told a staff sergeant that the decision was final and the matter was closed. They read the numbers. They read about the surrenders. They read about the caves collapsing one by one while the pomp-pomp sound echoed off the cliffs. And then they did what military bureaucracies have always done when confronted with the evidence of their own mistakes. They quietly authorized the change without ever admitting they had been wrong. No one was disciplined for denying Brennan's proposal. No one was blamed for the hundreds of Marines who died during the week that the solution sat 3 miles behind the front lines, pointing its guns at an empty sky. No one was called to account for the 3 separate refusals, each of which had cost time measured in human lives. The new order simply appeared in the daily operations briefing, typed on a standard form in standard military language. M19 gun motor carriage. authorized for ground support operations as required by tactical situation. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what had changed. No apology. As if it had always been this way. That is how the machinery of war processes its own failures. The wrong decision kills people. When the decision is finally corrected, the correction is presented as routine, as ordinary, as something that was always going to happen eventually. And the dead stay dead, and nobody signs their name next to the reason why. The name that stuck. After Sugarloaf, the infantry stopped calling the M19 the coffin on tracks. They stopped calling it the paper tank. They stopped making jokes about how long the crew would survive. They called it Cave Sweeper. The name spread through the 6th Marine Division like a rumor that turned out to be true. When a Japanese position was dug too deep into a hillside for Sherman tanks to engage, the call went out for Cave Sweeper. When a cliff face was honeycombed with firing positions that no amount of naval bombardment could silence, the call went out for Cave Sweeper. When the infantry needed to advance and the only thing stopping them was a row of dark mouths in a rock wall 30 feet above their heads, the call went out for Cave Sweeper. And when the twin Bofors guns opened up and the pomp-pomp sound rolled across the ridgelines, Marines moved forward with the confidence they had not felt in weeks. Because they had seen what those guns could do. They had watched the impregnable become the vulnerable. They had stood in the open and looked up at cave mouths that had been killing their friends for days and watched them crumble into dust and silence. After Sugarloaf, the 6th Marine Division continued south alongside the 1st Marine Division on the right flank. On May 27th, the Shuri Line finally collapsed. The Japanese withdrew to the southern end of the island where they prepared for a final stand in the rugged terrain around the Kianmu Escarpment and the hills near the village of Mabuni. But the secret was out. The cave system that had been the cornerstone of Japanese defensive strategy on Okinawa now had a counter. The M19 with its twin 40mm guns that could elevate to nearly vertical had turned what the Japanese considered their greatest advantage into a liability. The terrain that was supposed to protect them had become the weapon that destroyed them. The deeper they dug, the more effectively the confined spaces amplified the blast. The higher they positioned their caves, the more perfectly suited the M19's extreme elevation became. The fortress had met the weapon it was never designed to face. The cost of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days. It ended on June 22, 1945. It was the bloodiest engagement of the Pacific War, and the numbers deserve to be spoken plainly because the men who bled for them deserve at least that much. On the American side, more than 49,000 casualties. More than 12,000 killed in action. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding general of the 10th Army, killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18th, just 4 days before the battle ended. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat during the entire Pacific War. A 3-star general dead on a hillside 4 days short of victory. On the Japanese side, an estimated 110,000 soldiers killed. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, performed the ritual of seppuku on the morning of June 22nd in their command cave overlooking the sea. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the brilliant staff officer who had designed the Shuri Line defense, was the only senior member of the 32nd Army staff to survive. He survived because Ushijima gave him a direct order to live, to bear witness, to write down what had happened so that history would have at least one account from the Japanese side. Yahara was captured, and years later he published a book called The Battle for Okinawa, one of the rarest things in military history. An honest account from the losing side written by the man who planned the defense. And then there were the civilians. The people of Okinawa who had lived on their island for centuries before the empires came to fight over it. An estimated 140,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle. Some were killed in crossfire. Some died of disease and starvation. Some were used as human shields by Japanese soldiers. And some were driven to suicide by Japanese propaganda that told them the Americans would commit unspeakable atrocities, or by Japanese soldiers who forced them to kill themselves rather than allow them to surrender. Entire families, mothers holding their children, jumping from cliffs, in one of the cruelest chapters of a war defined by cruelty. Offshore, the American fleet endured nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks over the course of the campaign. 36 ships were sunk. 368 were damaged. The Navy's casualties at Okinawa exceeded those of the Army and Marines combined. The total cost of Okinawa horrified President Harry Truman. He looked at the numbers, and he looked at the plans for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands, which military planners estimated could produce between 400,000 and 1 million American casualties. And he made the decision that has been debated ever since. He authorized the use of the atomic bomb. Hiroshima, August 6th, Nagasaki, August 9th. The war ended on August 15th. Some historians argue that the horror of Okinawa made the atomic bomb inevitable. That the caves, the kamikazes, the 82 days of relentless killing created an arithmetic of suffering so extreme that any alternative, no matter how terrible, seemed preferable to another Okinawa multiplied across the entire Japanese homeland. The men who fought at Sugarloaf Hill did not know any of this at the time. They did not know they were fighting a battle that would help determine whether atomic weapons were used on cities full of civilians. They only knew the hill in front of them, the caves above them, and the men beside them. The hero without a medal. The man who broke the deadlock at Sugarloaf Hill never received a medal for it. Thomas Brennan finished the Okinawa campaign with his original M19, held together by field repairs and improvised welds and what Rossetti called faith in the Cadillac Motor Company. He fought for weeks after Sugarloaf, continuing the cave sweeper roll across the southern end of the island as American forces pursued the remnants of the Japanese 32nd Army into their final positions. But no medal came, no commendation, no official recognition of any kind for the unauthorized mission that had broken the most costly stalemate of the campaign. The reason was simple and permanent. To award Brennan a medal, the military would have to acknowledge that the mission was unauthorized, that the generals had been wrong to forbid it, that a staff sergeant had seen something that the entire command structure had missed, and that his disobedience had saved more lives in a single morning than some operations saved in a month. The system could not do that. The system was not built to do that. The system was built to function from the top down, and admitting that a sergeant had been right while generals had been wrong would crack something fundamental in the architecture of command. So the system did what it always does. It absorbed the success, erased the disobedience, and moved on as if nothing unusual had happened. Brennan received a quiet transfer to another unit, and a whispered thank you from Captain Hargrove delivered in person away from anyone else the night before Brennan shipped out. Hargrove, who remembered the feeling of watching his men die for a hill they could not take, and who remembered the morning when the pomp-pomp sound started and the dying stopped. That was all. A whispered thank you and a transfer order. For the man who turned a weapon, everyone mocked into the instrument that cracked the fortress that nothing else could touch. After the war, Brennan went home to Pittsburgh. He went back to the steel mill where his father had worked for 30 years. He married a woman named Catherine from the neighborhood. He had 2 sons and a daughter. He went to work every morning and came home every evening, and on Sundays he took his family to Mass at St. Bridget's, and afterward they ate dinner at his mother's house, and nobody talked about the war, because nobody in that generation talked about the war. When his oldest son asked him years later what he had done in the service, Brennan said 4 words: "I drove a vehicle." He did not mention Sugarloaf Hill. He did not mention the 3 refusals. He did not mention the night drive without orders, or the 60 seconds that Hargrove said would kill him, or the grenade that Rossetti caught with his bare hand and threw back. He did not mention the sound of cave mouths collapsing, or the young Japanese soldier who walked toward Sullivan with empty hands and dust on his face and fear in his eyes. He did not mention the pomp-pomp. Like most veterans of that generation, the generation we now call the greatest, Thomas Brennan carried the war inside himself in a silence that lasted the rest of his life. Not because he had forgotten, because he remembered everything. Every sound, every face, every cave mouth going dark, every shell casing that rained down on the turret floor. The smell of hot brass and limestone dust. The way Moretti kept firing with one arm while blood dripped off his elbow onto the traverse mechanism. The way Walsh's hands shook for 3 days afterward, but he never mentioned it. Some memories are too heavy to share and too important to forget. So you carry them alone. You go to work. You raise your children. You sit in the pew on Sunday morning and listen to the priest talk about peace. And you do not mention that you know what peace costs because you were there when the bill came due. And when your son asks you what you did in the war, you say 4 words and you go back to pouring steel. And nobody in the room knows that the man eating pot roast at the dinner table once drove a 14-ton vehicle into the mouth of hell without orders because it was the right thing to do. 50 years later, James Sullivan survived Okinawa. He went home to South Boston. He married a girl named Margaret, who had written him letters every week for 2 years. He got a job at the Quincy shipyard where his father worked. He had 3 children. He built a life. And he did not speak about Sugarloaf Hill for 40 years. In 1998, the United States government awarded a belated Medal of Honor to Major General James L. Day for actions at Sugarloaf Hill in May of 1945. Day had been a young corporal during the battle, and his extraordinary heroism over several days of fighting had finally been officially recognized more than half a century after it occurred. It was a real event, a real medal, a real reminder that Sugarloaf Hill had not been forgotten by everyone. Sullivan saw the ceremony on the evening news. He sat in his armchair in the triple-decker in South Boston, where he had lived for 35 years, the same neighborhood where he had grown up, the same street where he had ridden his bicycle as a boy before the war turned him into something older than his years. He watched a 93-year-old man in a wheelchair receive a medal for something that happened on a hill that most Americans had never heard of. The reporter said the words, "Sugarloaf Hill," out loud on national television. Sullivan's wife, Margaret, sitting on the couch beside him, noticed his hands gripping the armrests of the chair, hard enough to turn the knuckles white. She had been married to him for 47 years, and she had never once heard him say those 2 words. Something that had been sealed shut for 4 decades cracked open inside James Sullivan that evening, like a door rusted closed from decades of silence finally giving way. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. That night after Margaret had gone to bed, Sullivan called his son into the kitchen. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept above the refrigerator. He sat down at the same table where his family had eaten 10,000 meals, and for the first time in his life, he told someone about the hill. He told him about the mud and the blood and the smell of men who had been dead for days in tropical heat. He told him about the gunfire that came from invisible places in the rock and echoed off the cliff faces until you could not tell which direction was trying to kill you. He told him about Major Courtney standing in the darkness and asking who would come with him up the hill, and the 44 men who stood up, knowing that most of them would not come back down. And he told him about a vehicle that arrived before dawn on the morning of May 17th. A strange-looking machine with 2 gun barrels pointing at the sky, and armor so thin you could practically see through it. There was an Army staff sergeant. Sullivan's voice was shaking. He drove that anti-aircraft vehicle to the front line without orders. He drove it right up to the base of the cliff where everyone had been dying for 5 days. And he pointed those guns straight up, nearly vertical. And he fired. Sullivan paused. His hands were trembling on the arms of the chair. I do not remember his name. I do not know if he made it through the war. But I remember the sound. Those twin 40mm guns. Pomp, 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 pomp. He looked at his son. That was the first sound I heard in 5 days. That was not the sound of somebody dying. Weapons are capabilities, not categories. The lesson of Cave Sweeper is a lesson that war teaches over and over again to anyone willing to listen. Weapons do not have fixed purposes. They have capabilities. And the difference between a weapon that sits useless in the rear and a weapon that changes the course of a battle is not engineering. It is imagination. The generals looked at the M19 and saw a category. Anti-aircraft. A label on a form. A line item in an inventory. A weapon with a designated role that could not be changed because the manual said so, and the manual was written by people who had never stood at the base of a cliff watching cave mouths spit fire. Brennan looked at the M19 and saw capabilities. An elevation angle of 85 degrees. 2 rapid-firing cannons loaded with high explosive rounds. A mobile platform that could bring those capabilities to wherever the problem was. He did not see what the weapon was designed to do. He saw what the weapon could do. And that difference saved more lives than any medal could measure. The lesson did not end at Okinawa. When the M19 finally saw its first official combat in Korea, in 1950, it was not used as an anti-aircraft weapon. The United Nations completely controlled the skies over the Korean peninsula. There was nothing to shoot at above. So the M19 was deployed as an assault gun, a direct fire support weapon, exactly the role that Brennan had invented at Sugarloaf. The twin 40mm Bofors guns proved devastatingly effective against Chinese mass infantry assaults at the Chosin Reservoir and along the Pusan perimeter. Thousands of enemy soldiers charging in waves across open ground met the same pomp-pomp sound that had echoed off the cliffs of Okinawa 5 years earlier. History once again confirmed what a sergeant had figured out before the generals. In Vietnam, the M19's successor, the M42 Duster, carried the same twin 40mm turret on the chassis of an M41 Walker Bulldog light tank. It never fired at an aircraft in Vietnam. Not once. Instead, It became one of the most feared perimeter defense and convoy escort weapons in the entire theater. The pomp-pomp sound rolling across the jungle at night meant that an American fire base was not to be trifled with. And then came the most remarkable circle of all. The Bofors 40mm gun. The very same weapon that sat on the M19 was removed from retired M42 Dusters and mounted inside C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, creating the AC-130 Spectre gunship. A weapon that had started its life as a ground-based gun pointing up at the sky was now an airborne gun pointing down at the ground. From earth to sky to sky to earth. The full revolution. The Bofors that Brennan had elevated to 85 degrees at Sugarloaf was now flying at 20,000 feet, pouring fire downward through the darkness onto targets that thought they were hidden. The pattern continues into our own century. Commercial drones designed to photograph real estate are carrying grenades over battlefields in Ukraine. Toyota pickup trucks built to haul rice are mounting 50-caliber machine guns in Libya and Syria and becoming the most common combat vehicles on Earth. Smartphones designed for telephone calls are serving as reconnaissance platforms, artillery spotters, and command and control systems for entire infantry formations. Innovation in warfare always comes from outside the system, from the people who look at a tool and see not what it was made for, but what it can do. From the mechanics and the sergeants and the corporals who do not have the rank to change policy, but who have the intelligence to see solutions that the people above them have been trained to overlook. Brennan was not a general. He was not a West Point graduate. He was a steelworker's son from Pittsburgh, who had learned to fix machines in his father's shop, and who looked at a weapon the entire military had written off and saw the answer to a problem that was killing hundreds of Marines a week. Sometimes the most important innovation in a war is not a new weapon. It is a new way of using an old one. The Sound, the vertical war, was won by a vehicle that everyone said could not fight on the ground. The caves that swallowed battalions were collapsed by a gun that was only supposed to shoot at airplanes. The fortress that should have held for months fell in hours because one sergeant looked at his weapon and saw not what it was designed to do, but what it could do. Sometimes the thing that everyone mocks is the thing that saves everyone. Sometimes the coffin on tracks becomes the cave sweeper. Sometimes the pomp-pomp echoing off the cliffs is the sound of impossible angles and impossible odds. And one crew of 6 men who refused to accept that their weapon was useless. If this story hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every single like tells the algorithm that the crews who turned sky guns into cave killers deserve to be remembered. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because next week we are going to uncover another weapon that the generals tried to sideline. Another machine that everybody laughed at until it proved them all wrong. And drop a comment below. Answer me honestly. If you were standing in that open turret at the base of Sugarloaf Hill, grenades falling from above, rifle rounds punching through from overhead, your gunner hit in the shoulder and still firing with one hand, would you have kept loading those 4-round clips into the breech? Or would you have jumped for cover? I want to know. Because the 6 men in that turret already gave their answer. And their answer echoes off the cliffs of Okinawa to this day. Pomp-pomp,